Voters are not over-enamoured about the current crop of politicians. I've had some harsh things to say myself in the run-up to the launch of this programme. Perhaps a bit too harsh. But these are difficult and dangerous times, and we need our politicians to be on the top of their game. Week 2 of the election campaign of 2024, a campaign which so far has seen Labour and Tory treat the surprisingly small differences between them as if they were ideological chasms, which they're not. It makes for limited debate. Despite the argy-bargy, Labour will stick broadly to Tory fiscal rules on tax and spend. Both promise not to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT. This morning, Labour committed to 4 new subs for our nuclear deterrent. That's already government policy. Yesterday, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper told Times Radio that Labour wouldn't cut net migration, but refused to say by how much. That's pretty much what we've had from the Tories these past 14 years. Net migration, of course, has risen. The Tories are finding out the hard way that no matter what they say, and they've said some interesting things about national service and gender self-ID, the national mood is not to give them the time of day. That's a bed of barbed wire they've made for themselves. Labour's so far ahead in the polls and generally regarded as certain of victory that it's decided that the less it says, the better. That's probably a sensible election strategy, but it doesn't make for an enervating campaign. Except, of course, for the Lib Dems' Sir Edward Davey falling in the water. Voters are not over-enamoured about the current crop of politicians. I've had some harsh things to say myself in the run-up to the launch of this programme. Perhaps a bit too harsh. But these are difficult and dangerous times, and we need our politicians to be on the top of their game. The economy has been mired in stagnation. We need more ideas, more vision on how strong growth can be restored. Abroad, President Putin is preparing a summer offensive in Ukraine, which could change the balance of power in Europe, and not in a good way. On the other side of the world, President Xi's drums of war grow ever louder around Taiwan. Neither threat is addressed by arguing over whether defence spending should be increased by 0.1 or 0.2% by 2030, nor by Ed Davey falling in the water. The election will see a new generation on both sides of the House of Commons. New politicians for old and new challenges. We hope to speak to as many as we can in the days ahead to test their mettle, to see on your behalf if they're up to the task at hand. And of course, we'll always be the first to let you know when Ed Davey falls in the water. I'm Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio. Shortly, ex-Defence Secretary Ben Wallace will join us to mull over Labour's plans for defence, and George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, will be here to tell us what politics might offer outside of the mainstream. But first, as the old adage goes, politics, a week in politics is a long time. The parties climbed over and into their battle buses this week, but it was a bumpy road for them all. Old Labour butted heads with the new as Diane Abbott was told she wasn't welcome to stand for the Labour Party. Then suddenly she was.
No decision has been taken to bar Diane Abbott. The process that we were going through ended with the restoration of the whip the other day. So she's a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and no decision has been taken barring her.
Well, that's clear then, I think. Well, Rishi Sunak's call for the return of national service pitted man against man, generation against generation of voters. That's probably more the way to put it.
We're going to keep putting bold actions on the table that I think are going to transform this country for the better. Our plan, a new version of national service so young people can get the skills, opportunities that they need, that we can foster a culture of service in our country to make our society more cohesive, so that we can strengthen our country's resilience and security for the long term.
And over at the Lib Dems headquarters, there we go. It's a watery business. After 1 week, who, if anyone, is edging ahead or behind? I'm joined by Kate McCann, Times Radio's political editor. Kate, great to see you. Have you on my first show too? We've worked together before.
We have. Good to be here.
Broadcast studios. Now, I made some remarks there about the state of the campaign as we enter week 2. What's your general feeling about the campaign so far?
Yeah, I think after week one, it's fair to say very little has shifted. And that's pretty bad for the Tories. It's not that bad for Labour. And unfortunately for the Lib Dems, as you say, we all remember them for splashing into water. But perhaps that's the best they can do right now, because at least they're making the front pages. But look, the polls are showing no discernible movement. I think what's really interesting for me is that voters actually do quite like some of the things the Tories are talking about, particularly some of the things like national service in some areas are very attractive, but they're just not moving the polls for them.
It's interesting. It's almost nothing Rishi Sunak tried before he called the election made any difference. And now he's called an election, nothing makes any difference. We've had a busy morning on the campaign. We've had the Conservatives talking about changes to self-identification, gender self-identification. We've got Labour being now the party of defence. What did you make of events this morning?
Well, I think what I have taken away from Kemi Badenoch's morning round is that the Tories are determined to pursue this core vote strategy. And realistically, that means that they are zeroing in on the issues that they think will keep them voters in areas where they really need to hold on to them. Now, some pollsters have talked about the idea of Whitby woman. And actually, policies like this on gender do appeal to a certain group of people, particularly, maybe older women who feel that there is some unfairness in the current system. And gender policy can often be referred to as a culture war issue. What's fascinating about this one actually is something the government had recommended by an independent body. It's about the differences between the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act. It's actually quite complicated. And it's designed to make it clearer about single-sex spaces. It's not designed to discriminate in any way against anybody, but it is designed to make things clearer. So the policy is not necessarily a bad one, but what it tells us about what the Tories are doing is that they are sticking very clearly to this pursuit of their core votes. It's not very ambitious, and it's not breaking out of the mould, and it is causing some real frustration among Tory MPs, particularly up in the north in those seats that Boris Johnson held in 2019.
It may be the best they can hope for. It also depends on us forgetting that the Prime Minister who started this whole gender self-identification was that well-known left-winger Theresa May.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll come to that. Let me just play you something. John Healey, the Labour Shadow Defence Secretary, Labour's big announcement being on defence this morning, particularly the nuclear deterrent. This is what he had to tell Breakfast this morning, that his party has changed on defence.
This is new defence plans to guarantee the UK's nuclear deterrent for generations to come. It's the bedrock of our defence and our national security. And with threats increasing and growing Russian aggression, the triple lock provides protection for the UK and for our NATO allies. It means first, we will build in government 4 new nuclear submarines in Barrow. We will maintain the continuous at-sea deterrence, and we will deliver the upgrades that are required to keep the submarines patrolling our seas and keep the country safe.
What he's really saying is we'll continue with existing government policy, because that is exactly existing government policy. But I also get the feeling, interesting what you think, that, and it's not just true of this, that quite often they're kind of trying to cut the Tories off at the pass, that you can't go for us in defence now. You might have done under Mr Corbyn. You can't now. Look, we're solid for the nuclear deterrent. And that is motivating even Yvette Cooper yesterday saying, we're going to cut net migration. Don't you worry about that. I can't give you a number, but we are going to cut it. Is that the Labour strategy, where it matters to make sure there's not much difference with the government?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's what they have actually been doing under the radar for probably a couple of years now, really carefully positioning the party to be capable and trusted on the economy, defence, security, the issues where traditionally the Tory party is far stronger. And we've seen the polling shift in Labour's favour. So clearly it has worked. I think Trident is a particularly difficult issue for Labour because so many in the shadow cabinet have previously voted against it. And that really is a red line.
Angela Rayner?
Yeah, and David Lammy.
Yeah.
And David Lammy, remember, will hold a really important position, potentially, in Labour's next cabinet. So for many voters who will have heard that in the past, they may hear from today from John Healey and think, do I trust you? Am I sure? So I think Labour's decision to appoint 14 former military veterans into some of their, most important seats is a sign that they get it and they are determined to do something about it. I thought it was fascinating that John Healey's opinion piece in The Sun, used the word patriotism or patriotic, I think 5-6 times, which shows you, doesn't it, this continuation of Keir Starmer's love affair with the Union flag and, Labour's sort of opening its arms up to this idea that, we're not snobby about this stuff. We're not ashamed of going near it. And I think that's really important for them.
Because John Healey, the Shadow Defence Minister Secretary, he's an old-fashioned Labour patriot. He's on the right of the party. He's a kind of Labour politician that gave us membership of NATO under Attlee way back in the late 1940s, developed Britain's nuclear deterrent. People forget that the British nuclear deterrent started under a Labour government, not under a Conservative government. So he's not the person that has to convince us. Has he really convinced Angela Rayner, David Lammy and so on? You mentioned how complicated this whole gender self-ID business is and so on. Let's just hear from Kemi Badenoch, the Business Secretary and the Equalities Minister, what she had to say about differences between sex and gender. She said she was going to clarify it. Let's listen.
A lot of the problems we have are around self-identification, where people simply declare that they are someone that they are something different, and that is an area that does need tightening up. The number of people with a gender recognition certificate is not that much. We have seen an increase, but we want to make sure that those people who are choosing to exploit the legislation do not actually make life more difficult for trans people.
Did that clear things up?
I think it's I think it's one of those things. If you really care about this as an issue, you fully understand it. You will be listening very carefully to what Kemi Badenoch is saying in that clip, and you may or may not agree. I think for the vast majority of people, this will not be the deciding vote for them in the general election. So the Tories here are speaking to a very specific group of people. And what they are saying is, we are going to protect your rights as a biological woman, largely. That's what this argument centres around. And the fear has been...
It is quite popular too. People understand that.
That element of it is very popular. And what Kemi Badenoch was doing this morning was talking about the examples of rape crisis centres and, spaces where, in theory, this may become complicated. I think in reality, there has been a legal backing for people to be excluded, but it has sometimes become clouded.
All right. Now, an event this afternoon, which has just come onto the diary, I think, Nigel Farage calling an emergency election statement or something. What's
Very excited.
Oh, it is.
Are you pumped?
I'm pumped up. I've never been more pumped up since I last fell asleep. Tell me, do we know what this is about?
No, and I tell you what, nor do a lot of the Reform senior team, it turns out, because I think that this has been sprung on them as a surprise. We've got a tweet from Nigel Farage saying he's calling an emergency press conference, as you say, at 4:00 today. There's been lots of speculation about whether or not that is him standing as a candidate, which he's previously ruled out in pretty strong terms, or whether it may well be a defection. I've been having a look at some of the most likely seats where a defection could happen. And it's important for me to say here that Isabel Oakeshott, who is linked to the leader of Reform, Richard Tice, she's tweeted to say that Reform will not be standing down any candidates. So we can't expect any candidates for Reform to be replaced this afternoon, or that's what she seems to be saying. There are maybe a couple of areas where there is the potential for a defection. One of them is Hartlepool, but Jill Mortimer, the Tory MP there, senior Tory figures don't expect that she would defect. Others have been talking about Lucy Allen, but if Lucy Allen were to defect, it would mean replacing a Reform candidate. So it all seems a bit complicated to me.
I thought the story in the Sunday Times was right yesterday. Farage has lost so many election campaigns to get into the Commons that it makes more sense if the Tories really are reduced to a rump after the election. He and Reform will try and move in for a takeover of the Tory party.
Yeah.
That seems a more likely scenario.
Which, in theory, it would make more sense for him not to stand in this election.
Exactly. Okay, we shall see though.
We'll see.
Times Radio will be across it. Thanks, Kate.